the secret prayer Jesus, use that most Christians never knew. In our last video, we explored the story of a man who flatlined for 6 full minutes on a hospital operating table and came back describing a figure of blinding light who knew his name before he even spoke a word. Thousands of you commented that it changed the way you pray, that it changed the way you see God entirely. But what we're about to share today goes even deeper, because this isn't just a story about dying and coming back. This is a story about a woman who was shown something inside heaven that most pastors have never preached about, a prayer so ancient, so powerful, and so personal that it was hidden in plain sight inside Scripture all along. Stay with us. You do not want to miss a single second of this. What if everything you thought you knew about prayer was only half the story? What if, somewhere between this life and the next, a woman was handed the missing piece, a way of speaking to God that Jesus himself practiced in his darkest moment, and almost no one alive knows it exists? Her name is Margaret Olston. She was a Sunday school teacher from a small town in Georgia. She had read her Bible cover to cover 11 times. She led prayer groups. She tithed faithfully. She thought she understood prayer. And then she died. And in the minutes her heart stopped beating, she was shown something that unraveled and rebuilt her faith from the ground up. What she brought back with her is not a new doctrine. It is not a secret society or a hidden gospel. It is something breathtaking in its simplicity and shattering in its depth. This is her story. Margaret Olston grew up in Valdosta, Georgia, the youngest daughter of a Baptist deacon and a woman who kept a worn King James Bible on the kitchen table like most families keep a fruit bowl, always present, always within reach. Faith wasn't just part of her upbringing. It was the architecture of her entire life. She married young, raised 3 children, and by her early 50s had become one of the most beloved figures at Cornerstone Fellowship Church, the congregation she had attended since she was 9 years old. She taught Sunday school for 22 years. She organized the women's prayer circle every Thursday morning at 7 a.m. She was the kind of woman who showed up to the hospital when church members were sick, who left casseroles on doorsteps without signing her name, who stayed after every service to pray with whoever needed it. If you asked anyone in that congregation to name one person who truly walked with God, they would have said Margaret without blinking. But for all her faithfulness, for all her years of scripture memorization and sunrise prayers and tear-stained devotionals, Margaret carried a quiet, persistent ache that she rarely spoke aloud. She felt like something was missing, not in her theology, not in her church, but in her prayers. She would kneel beside her bed each night and speak to God earnestly, genuinely, and yet there were moments when her words felt like letters dropped into a mailbox she wasn't sure anyone was reading. She loved God deeply. She just sometimes wondered if God could hear her the way she longed to be heard. She had no idea that the answer to that longing was about to come, not through a sermon, not through a book, but through the most terrifying experience of her life. The incident. It was a Wednesday in October, the kind of crisp Georgia autumn day that makes the whole world feel like a painting. Margaret had just finished leading a midweek prayer service and was driving home along a 2-lane country road she had traveled 1,000 times. The sun was low and orange, filtering through the pine trees in long, golden bars of light. She remembers turning down the radio to finish a prayer she had started in the church parking lot. She doesn't remember the deer stepping onto the road. She doesn't remember jerking the wheel. What she does remember, with a clarity that still leaves her breathless when she describes it, is the sound. A single, enormous crack, like the world itself splitting open. And then silence. Total, absolute silence. The kind of silence that has no bottom. Her car had left the road, rolled twice through a shallow embankment, and come to rest against a stand of pine trees. The airbag had deployed, but the impact had been catastrophic. Her chest had struck the steering column. 3 ribs were shattered. 1 drove inward. And somewhere in the wreckage of that quiet country road, Margaret Olston's heart stopped beating. A passing driver spotted the tire tracks in the gravel and called 911. First responders arrived in 11 minutes. To understand what happened next, you need to understand that 11 minutes is a very long time for a human heart to be still. The death moment. The paramedics who reached Margaret's car that evening later said they were not expecting to find her alive. Her color was wrong. Her pulse was absent. The damage to her chest wall had caused what emergency medicine calls a traumatic cardiac arrest. Not a heart attack in the traditional sense, but a sudden, violent cessation of the heart's ability to function. They began CPR immediately, working in the cramped space beside the overturned vehicle, calling her name into a silence that did not answer back. She was clinically dead for approximately 14 minutes before her heart responded to defibrillation. 14 minutes. And in those 14 minutes, Margaret Ulston was somewhere else entirely. She would later describe the transition not as a darkness or a falling, but as a lifting, as if the weight of her body had simply been set down, the way you might set down a heavy bag you've been carrying for so long you forgot it was there. One moment she was in the car. The next moment, she simply wasn't. There was no pain. There was no fear. There was only a stillness so profound and so warm that she says the closest earthly comparison she can offer is the feeling of being held by someone who loves you without condition. Except that feeling, she says, was multiplied by something so far beyond human language that she stops trying to find the right word and simply says, more. It was just more of everything good. The experience. What happened next, Margaret says, unfolded not in the way a dream unfolds, fragmented, shifting, dissolving, but the way a memory unfolds. Clear, sequential, permanently etched. She became aware of movement, though she had no body she could see. She was traveling, or more accurately, she was being carried, through a space of such deep and luminous darkness that the word darkness no longer feels accurate. It was not the absence of light. It was more like the moment just before dawn, when the sky holds its breath and everything is possible. And then the light came. Not all at once. It began as a warmth at the edge of her awareness. The way the sun feels on your face before you open your eyes. And as she moved toward it, or as it moved toward her, she still isn't sure it grew into something vast and living and intelligent. This was not the light of a bulb or a flame or even the sun. This was a light that knew her. She felt it recognize her the way a mother recognizes her child's cry across a crowded room. Personal, immediate, certain. She stood, though she had no feet, at the threshold of something she can only describe as a garden, though that word is far too small. The colors, she says, were not colors she had seen before. Not new colors exactly, more like the true versions of colors, the originals, the ones that every earthly rose and every autumn sky are only trying to imitate. And there in that place she saw him. She does not describe what she saw the way people describe a person. She says there was a figure, a presence, and that the moment she perceived it, every question she had ever carried about whether God was real, whether prayer mattered, whether she was truly known and loved, every one of those questions dissolved. Not because she was told the answers, but because in his presence, the questions themselves became unnecessary. She says he looked at her the way she had always hoped God would look at her, not as someone he was evaluating, but as someone he had been waiting for. He spoke to her, not in words that entered through ears she didn't have, but in a form of communication that she describes as total, as if the meaning was placed directly inside her, complete and whole, the way light fills a room when you open a curtain. The message. What he showed her next is the heart of everything Margaret has spent the last 9 years trying to explain. She was shown a moment in scripture she had read dozens of times, the night in Gethsemane, the night before the crucifixion, when Jesus went alone into the garden and prayed. She had always understood that scene as a moment of surrender, Jesus asking the Father to remove the cup, then submitting to the Father's will. And that understanding was not wrong, but she had only seen the surface of it. What she was shown in that luminous place was the structure beneath the prayer, the architecture of how Jesus actually spoke to God in his most desperate hour, and it was not what she expected. Jesus did not begin with a request. He did not begin with worship or confession or thanksgiving, the 4-step models she had taught in Sunday school. He began with presence, pure, unguarded, unperformed presence. He entered that garden and he simply brought himself, his actual self, the terrified, grieving, fully human self, and he placed that self before the Father without editing it first. The message she received, And she is careful to say this is her understanding of what she was shown, not a word-for-word transcript from heaven, was this. Most people pray from the self they wish they were. Jesus prayed from the self he actually was, and the Father met him there. She was shown that prayer in its truest form is not a performance of faith. It is the offering of your actual inner state to a God who already knows it, but who waits, with infinite patience, for you to stop pretending he doesn't. The moment you stop managing the conversation and simply arrive in it, fully, honestly, without the curated version of yourself you present even to yourself, something opens. Not because God was closed before, but because you were. She was shown the specific words Jesus prayed that are not recorded in the Gospels. Not a new revelation, she is clear about that, but an illumination of the Spirit behind the words that are recorded. The phrase Abba, Father, that intimate Aramaic word for Papa, for Daddy, was not, she understood in that moment, simply a title. It was the entire posture of the prayer. It was a child climbing into a parent's lap in the dark, not with a list of demands, but with a shaking heart and nowhere else to go. That is the secret, not a formula, not a technique, a posture, the posture of a child who has stopped pretending to be okay. And then he told her it was not yet her time. Return to life. The paramedics later described what happened on that roadside as one of those calls you don't forget. The lead responder, a man named Darius with 17 years in emergency medicine, said that when Margaret's heart finally responded to the second defibrillation attempt, her first action was not a gasp or a convulsion, the physical drama you see in movies. She simply opened her eyes, and she was, in his words, completely calm, eerily calm, like someone waking from the best sleep of their life. She asked in a clear and quiet voice if anyone had a pen. She said she needed to write something down before she forgot it. One of the paramedics, slightly stunned, handed her a marker from his kit. She wrote 3 words on the inside of her wrist, pressing through the oxygen mask they had placed on her face. The words were, Abba here, honest. She kept those words visible on her arm for the first 3 days in the ICU, asking the nurses not to wash them off. She told anyone who asked that she needed to remember what she had been shown before the medical routine of recovery pulled her back into ordinary time. Her physical recovery was slow and serious. The damage to her chest wall required surgery. She spent 11 days in the hospital and 3 months in rehabilitation. But the doctors who treated her remarked, more than once, that her mental and emotional state throughout the ordeal was unlike anything they typically encountered in trauma patients of her severity. There was no anxiety, no depression, no fear of death. One of her physicians, a cardiologist named Dr. Yolanda Pierce, told Margaret's daughter that in 30 years of practice, she had never seen a patient with that level of physical trauma carry that level of peace. She said it was, in her clinical opinion, inexplicable. Life transformation. Margaret went home from the hospital a different woman. Not different in the ways you might expect. She didn't change denominations or abandon her church or begin speaking in a new vocabulary of spiritual celebrity. She went right back to Cornerstone Fellowship. She sat in the same pew. She taught Sunday school again when she was physically able. But something had shifted at the center of everything she did. Her prayers changed. The Thursday morning prayer circle noticed it first. Where Margaret had once led polished, articulate prayers, the kind of prayers that comfort a room, she now prayed differently. She prayed out loud about her confusion, about her fear, about the mornings when she woke up and felt hollow and couldn't find God in the hollowness. She stopped leading prayers like a teacher, demonstrating the right way to do something, and started praying like someone who genuinely needed the conversation to be real. And something happened to that prayer circle. Attendance doubled within 6 months. Women who had sat in that circle for years and smiled politely and said, "I'm fine, just pray for my cousin's surgery." Those women started showing up early, started crying in the middle of sentences, started saying the true things they had been carrying alone for decades. Margaret's willingness to be unpolished in God's presence gave everyone around her permission to do the same. She began sharing her story publicly, first at her own church, then at a women's retreat in Alabama, then at a conference in Tennessee. She never built a brand around it. She turned down opportunities to monetize it. She simply told what she had seen and what she had been shown, and she let the story do what it was going to do. She went back to the passage in Gethsemane and studied it for weeks with new eyes. She found that the word Jesus used, Abba, appears only 3 times in the entire New Testament, and each time it is used in a moment of raw, unmanaged emotion. Not in a sermon, not in a temple teaching, only in moments of anguish, of desperation, of a child who has run out of other options. She became convinced that this was not coincidence. She became convinced that the Father designed intimacy to be the response to honesty, not the reward for performance. She wrote about this in a small, self-published journal she distributed at her church. It was photocopied and passed around and eventually found its way online, not because she promoted it, but because people who read it said it felt like someone had finally given a name to something they had always felt but never known how to say. Margaret still lives in Valdosta. She still wakes before sunrise to pray, but she says her prayers now begin the same way every morning, not with praise, not with petition, not with any of the good and right things she was taught. They begin with 2 words spoken into the quiet of her bedroom, into the dark of the early morning, the same 2 words Jesus spoke in a garden on the worst night of his earthly life. Abba, Father. Just that, just the name, just the posture, just the admission that she has come and she is here, and she is not pretending to be anything other than what she is. And she says, with the certainty of someone who has stood on the other side of the veil and come back, that the Father is always, always already there. Viewer reflection. So here is what I want to leave you with today. Not a theology, not an argument, just a question. When you pray, and I mean really pray, not the version of prayer you perform because you think that's what God requires. When you speak to God in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when no one else is watching, who do you bring to that conversation? The cleaned-up version of yourself? The faithful, composed, have-it-together version? Or do you bring the actual one? The one who is frightened or angry or doesn't understand why things went the way they went? The one who maybe, if we're being honest, is not entirely sure the mailbox has anyone on the other side. Because if what Margaret was shown is true, and she is not the only one who has come back from the edge of eternity with a version of this same message, then the most revolutionary thing you could do in your prayer life today is not to say better words or spend more time or follow a more disciplined method. It might simply be to stop editing yourself before you arrive. Abba, Father, here I am. This is what's actually inside me today. I trust you with it. That's it. That's the posture Jesus modeled in the garden. That's the prayer that moved heaven. I'd love to know what this story stirred in you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment in prayer where you felt like something truly opened? Or maybe you've been carrying that quiet ache Margaret described, that sense that your prayers aren't quite reaching. Share it. You might be speaking for someone else who's watching and doesn't have the words yet. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs it. Not for the channel, for them. Because sometimes a story is the thing that finds a person exactly when they needed to be found. We'll see you in the next one.